My name is Donald Kirkley, and my association with H.L. Mencken goes back to my connection with the Baltimore Sun, which began in 1920. What you're about to hear is, to the best of my knowledge, the only recording of his voice ever made, except for a few transcripts of radio broadcasts, which were not preserved. On June 30th, 1948, at the request of the Library of Congress, I persuaded Mr. Mencken to come to Washington for this interview. He was a somewhat reluctant witness, having a deep distrust of microphones, and he agreed to come only after I had baited the hook with the statement that his voice was to be saved for posterity. Because we wanted this to be a natural record, we did no rehearsing. He didn't know what questions were to be asked, and I made them up as we went along. So you're actually eavesdropping on an informal conversation following natural lines, and hearing Mr. Mencken speak just as his friends and associates heard him day after day. You will notice that his voice seems a little tired, and that there are some signs of the recurrence of his annual affliction, hay fever. He had reported a political convention for the Sun and had not quite recovered from the fatigue. During the recording, I mentioned the fact jokingly that what we were putting on tape might be heard by people 1,000 years hence. At the time, Mr. Mencken seemed to pay no attention to this, but on the way home he was thoughtful for a few moments, and then he said, "Do you really think that people will be listening to this 1,000 years from now?" I said, "Well, Henry, I hope so, for my sake as well as yours." The recording was made in a small room at the library on a warm day in June, and I now gladly turn over the microphone to Mr. Mencken, who was sitting opposite me, chewing his favorite cigar with some belligerence and looking somewhat like a literary lion at bay.
Well, we're on the air. Henry?
Air? We're not on the air.
Well,
we're on the platter.
Let's call it hot air.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. I'm a little confused after that ride over from Baltimore. Did you ever see such a hideous boulevard in your life?
I suppose there are boulevards just as terrible, but I'd never have seen any. No, it's a disgrace to humanity without question.
Why?
Well, because it represents the American lust for the hideous, the delight in ugliness for its own sake. It's very appropriately, it leads to the capital of the United States.
I remember you using that phrase quite often when you wrote for the Sun papers, the American libido for the ugly.
Yeah.
That was a favorite topic.
Yeah. Well, the idea in that was this, that such horrible exhibitions are not due to mere ignorance and innocence. There is a positive delight in the ugly. You can, if you go down the street in Baltimore in those endless rows of two-story houses on a summer night, you can look in them. They're usually illuminated more or less. And you notice you go sometimes for 2 or 3 blocks without seeing a single object that's not hideous. Not a single thing. Not even a picture on the wall or a carpet or a rug. Then all of a sudden, you'll see in even the meanest neighborhoods a house very tastefully decorated.
Such as your house at 1524 Holland?
No, mine is not one, but there is a colored woman that lived in the alley behind me who in a little 4-room house did a swell job of decorating. I don't know who she was or what became of her. She's finally disappeared. But she had this little house beautifully decorated with simple means. Cheap, but good. The color scheme was good, and the arrangement of things was good. Now, what that signifies, I don't know. I haven't decided.
You were born in one of those 2-story row houses, weren't you?
Yeah, I was born in Lexington Street in Baltimore near Fremont.
And you still live in one of those 2-story houses?
No, it's a 3-story.
3-story, well...
It was 3-story, the one I was born into. My father bought the house I'm at present living in 1883.
It's a mark of great success in a Baltimorean when he's born in a 2-story house and works up to live in a 3-story house.
Yes, yeah, that is, but I had, unfortunately, didn't come up from that log cabin. My misfortune was that my father was relatively well off. It's been a curse to me all my life. Nobody will believe me on that ground. It seems to be the idea in America that no man is worth listening to unless he's had some experience in sweatshops. No, I'm all right.
What are your earliest recollections of Baltimore as a boy?
Well, I've written a book describing them. My first recollection is of the Oriole Parade in Baltimore in 1883. I've been told by psychologists and other such frauds that you couldn't possibly recollect anything that early. I was 3 years old precisely. But I remember it. I recall it very distinctly. And it wasn't told to me. Baltimore, I knew as a boy, was extraordinarily hot in summer and filthy. It was full of flies, mosquitoes. All kinds of epidemics were running simultaneously. But the people liked it. Food was cheap. Houses were comfortable, although we slept under mosquito nets. And I look back on it with great affection. I realize its limitations. There were no sewers, and water supply was bad. Typhoid raged all summer, smallpox all winter, malaria at all times of the year. I had malaria, but I escaped typhoid and smallpox. How, I don't know. I think I escaped smallpox by a vaccination. The family doctor, old Dr. Wiley, vaccinated me when I was about 2 years old, and the scar was so enormous that it's still big as $50 on my arm, and no vaccination that I've ever had since has taken, as they say. I've been told that that's no proof of anything, but nevertheless, there is the fact.
What schools did you go to?
I went to a school kept by an old German named Friedrich Knapp, known to Americans as Knapp. The school was down in Halliday Street, where the War Memorial is now. And it was a private school. I went there till I was 12 years old, and then I transferred to Polytechnic.
That's a high school.
Yeah. I never got beyond the Polytechnic. I graduated at the Polytechnic very early. I was only 15. And never went to school since, thank God. Most men that escaped college have a regret that pursues them. But I must confess I'm much too vain to have any such regrets. I think of what I was doing when the boys of my generation were in college, listening to idiot lectures and cheering football games and doing all the foolish and silly and useless things that college boys do. I was a young reporter on the street, and I believe...
How old?
18. I believe that a young newspaper reporter in a big city at that time led a life that has never been matched on earth for romance and interest.
Well, the general belief is that you were a born reporter, and I believe there's an interesting story as to how you got your first job.
No, the story's not interesting. I simply applied for it and got it. I never was a good reporter.
Well, you see, always there are legends. The legends are that you offered to work for nothing and went out and came back with some big feature story.
No, I never got a scoop in my life. They were the things that were esteemed in those days. They never seemed to me to have any sense. Most scoops were bad stories, and they were always exaggerated and played up in an idiot manner. No, I wasn't a good reporter, except in one sense, that I worked. I was willing to work. I'd never shirked the job.
With what papers did you work?
I started with the Baltimore Herald, and that was the end of my experience as a reporter, because I became a Sunday editor very early, at 23, and a city editor right afterwards.
What paper?
Same Herald.
Same Herald.
And hence, I did very little reporting after the age of 25. In later years, I went back to reporting as a kind of volunteer, but I did only things that were chosen by myself.
Well, when did you begin your association with the Sun papers?
About 1907, I should say. That's when the Herald blew up. I was then managing editor of the Herald, and the thing blew up under me. And I hear young reporters talking about the hazards of their life. I've been sold down the river 3 times in my life, and every time to my advantage.
Well, did you have a definite goal in view at the time you were working as a newspaper man?
No. I was so busy I didn't have time to do any thinking. I wrote short stories, and when I was 20, I wrote a short story that attracted the attention of Ellery Sedgwick, later editor of the Atlantic Monthly. And Sedgwick took an interest in me and, in fact, offered me a job on a magazine he was then editing in New York called Frank Leslie's Popular Monthly. I refused it, but Sedgwick and I became friends and have been friends ever since. Insofar as anybody discovered me, it was Ellery Sedgwick. I see him very seldom in late year, but we remain on very good terms.
Now, at a certain point, you established a beachhead in New York in what you might call literary circles and began commuting back and forth. How did you do that? How did that come about?
Well, in 1908, I think it was, I was offered a job of writing a monthly literary article for the old Smart Set. That was one of many offers that I was getting in those days. I was getting fairly well known among the magazines, and they suggested things for me to do. I took it because it didn't involve going to New York. I disliked New York and still do, and didn't want to go there. Didn't want to live there. And I wrote that article for 6 years. And then the Smart Set blew up when the war came on in 1914. And, through a complicated series of events that are not interesting, George Nason and I acquired control of the editorial department of it. He had been doing a little shorter than while I had an article on the theaters. And we ran the magazine as joint editors for 10 years. And it was very valuable to us. We had something that is a dream of every young writer. We had a magazine that we controlled and which printed everything we wrote without any interference by anybody else. It was an enormously valuable thing. Most of the stuff that I printed in the Smart Set in those days, and some of it attracted attention, could not have got into any other known magazine at that time. Well, in the end, we both got tired of it, and I did especially, and Smart Set had a bad title, which we couldn't change. It was short of money, and there wasn't any future in it. We had sucked out of it everything we wanted, so we decided to start another magazine, and we started the American Mercury, which was an enormously different magazine. The Smart Set was the most dreadful piece of printing in New York, and the American Mercury was the finest piece of printing that has ever been done in an American magazine. And, well, we lasted 10 years there, and I decided to quit. Because I've had a feeling all my life that 10 years is long enough for any job. That after that it gets more routinized, and the man really is tired of it, and had better clear out if you can.
Now, when you were associated with the Smart Set and the American Mercury, it's a great surge of vitality was taking place all through the literary world in America.
Yes.
The new writers were being discovered, some of them now famous, and you had a great deal to do with that, you and Nathan.
Well, we did our share of it. We were always especially alert for young authors. We discovered, remember, a great many who never amounted to a damn. They disappeared in their time. I should say for 10 authors that we hooped along, not one survives today. But among the survivors are some very good men.
For instance?
Well, I wouldn't like to mention individuals for reasons plain enough. I might forget one who ought to be in the list. You know some of them.
Yes.
And I must say I was always credited with more part in that than I really deserved. After all, you can't discover an author who is not good in himself. The most your so-called discoverer does is to recognize the fact that the man is good. The man was good anteriorly. And nothing that the editor does helps him. I'm thoroughly convinced that editors don't help authors. Either a man is good or he's bad. And if he's good, he'll bust through in one way or another. If he's bad, no conceivable help will help him. For that reason, I don't believe in teaching writing.
Do you remember the Battle of the Century? The great prize fight in Boyle's 30 acres between Dempsey and Carpentier?
Yes, I covered it. I covered it to the Baltimore Sun and the New York World. There was a very curious episode, that fight. There were a lot of professional sports reporters there, and they were all unanimously in favor of Carpentier for sentimental reasons. Dempsey, it appeared, had not been a war hero, and Carpentier had. And while it was plain to a child who looked at him that Carpentier couldn't conceivably beat Dempsey, why, these reporters, some of whom were very good, constantly sought during the fight for evidences of Carpentier making some impression on Dempsey. And in the 8th round, Carpentier happened to hit Dempsey, who staggered a bit, as a man will when he's caught off his balance. And the stories the next day, some of them, all were to the effect that Carpentier had nearly knocked out Dempsey. Well, I was innocent and ignorant, not being a sporting reporter, and I didn't mention any such episode. I mentioned the fact that he'd been hit him, but reported that he hadn't made any impression on him whatever. This developed into a controversy. And some of the sporting professionals insisted that Dempsey had been staggered. And after the controversy went on for a week or two, it occurred to somebody to go to see Carpentier and Dempsey. And Dempsey's reply was that he hadn't felt the thing at all, and Carpentier's reply was that so far as he knows, he hadn't made any impression on Dempsey whatsoever. That is a wonderful proof, of which there are many, that people believe what they want to believe. Now, the feeling against Dempsey at that fight was very bitter. And some of the sporting experts shared it. And another thing that I derived as a moral from the whole episode is this, that so-called experts are just ordinary men at bottom, and that you can't trust them, their judgment in an emotional situation any more than you can trust anybody else's.
Well, Dempsey went on, as you know, to live down his reputation as a draft dodger and became one of the most popular men in sports. Later on, I think we should say that in justice to Dempsey.
Without
been a pretty decent and
there was nothing wrong with Dempsey.
He was badly managed.
He was badly managed. I didn't hold anything against him on the ground that he wasn't a war hero. I wasn't myself.
But we don't want Dempsey misjudged 1,000 years from now when somebody plays back this record.
Well, naturally not. I think that Dempsey later on kept a saloon in New York, which I often went into, which had good food and the best mint juleps ever served in New York. Old Edgar Lee Masters and I used to go in there and always drink a couple of those mint juleps. He charged $1 for them 15 years ago, and they were well worth it.
I don't think you'd better go on record as a mint julep drinker. Isn't beer your main...
I don't drink much beer. That's a legend that's...
I know, but I mean, haven't you always been a connoisseur of beer and a champion of beer as a drink?
Yes, I think beer is a cheap, excellent drink.
I mean, you were always making us thirsty during Prohibition by mentioning the better brands of European beer with which you were acquainted. I remember that distinctly.
I naturally, when I went abroad, drank the wine of the country, and if I was in Germany or Denmark, I drank beer. If I was in Italy, I certainly wouldn't drink beer, or Spain, or even France, although the German beers were always for sale in France. That was an exaggeration, my beer drinking. I'm actually ambibulous. I drink every known alcohol drink.
What was that word?
Ambibulous.
That's a very fine word.
I drink every known alcoholic drink and enjoy them all. And I've always learnt early in life how to handle alcohol and never had any trouble with it. Its rules are as simple as mud. First, never drink if you've got any work to do. Never. If I've got a job of work to do at 10 o'clock at night, I wouldn't take a drink up to that time. Secondly, never drink alone. That's the way to become a drunkard. And thirdly, even if you haven't got any work to do, never drink while the sun is shining. Wait until it's dark. By that time, you're near enough to bed to recover quickly. I think the danger of alcohol is largely consists of this. If a man starts to drink too early in the day, or when he's got anything that puts a strain on him to do, as the alcohol goes out, or even while it's still in, he notices a letting down. No man can work as well with alcohol in him. He notices a letting down, and he's tempted to drink some more, which removes that feeling of being let down. And the result is he gets on a wheel, and he drinks too much. I am fond of drinking a reasonable amount. My doctor tells me that in his judgment, and he's one of the best doctors in America, alcohol to a man over 60 is not only harmless, but a positive benefit. He said it has an effect on the heart muscle that seems to be very salubrious, and that the man who drinks a moderate amount, at least according to my program, is not only not harmed, but benefited, which is good news to me.
As you know, I myself evolved or degenerated into a dramatic critic. Didn't you? That's what I was going to ask you. Yeah. Weren't you a drama critic at one time?
That's true. I was a dramatic critic for, 7 or 8 years. What's more, I was a good one, as I once proved to my old colleague George Nason, who looked on me as a mere amateur, and I dug up some of my old criticisms and showed that I was saying the things 10 years before that all the rest of the boys were saying then. For instance, I was not fooled by the frauds of that era. That was the era of 1905 to 10, say. The country was full of them, all because there were kinds of terrible plays that were being produced and taken seriously, plays by Augustus Thomas and Charles Klein. I always treated them as trash. There were stars at that time who were looked on with reverence by the public. I always treated them as trash. One of the great heroes of the time that I tackled once was Richard Mansfield. He was a kind of demigod in those days. And I told the truth about him when he played in a play called Don Juan by Schiller. He was playing an 18-year-old boy, and he was a man in the 50s. And he looked it. And it was a foul and terrible performance. Well, it got under Mansfield's skin, and he wrote me some letters protesting and invited me to come to see him, which I never did. In those days, I made it a rule never to meet an actor if I could help it.
A very good rule.
Yeah, it was a good rule. I had nothing to do with stage people. I naturally knew some of them. Some of them I was very fond of. But I did not frequent theater society, and never in my life did I go to a theater party given by a manager to celebrate the opening of a new play, and I assume that they still give such parties, do they?
No more. The theater is too poor at present.
Yeah.
The movie people give the parties.
Do they?
They're ghastly. They're worse than the theater parties. To come back to something that I intended to ask, what do you think of the newspaper guild as an influence in journalism?
I think it's been I think the idea of the newspaper guild is good, but the influence of the guild has been bad. Almost unqualifiedly bad, for the reason that it got into the hands of the wrong man. Beginning with the first of them, Hayward Boone. As I said some time ago, I've been sold down the river 3 times in my life. Papers sold or busted under me. It happened that every time, having been born lucky, it was a good thing for me. But I saw and knew intimately many men for whom it was a dreadfully tragic thing. And I always believed that the men on a newspaper, or any group of men, ought to have some machinery for compensating their individual impotence. I lived through the time when a old-time ice wagon driver city editor might come down in the morning with a hangover and fire a man simply because he was in bad humor. That is not theory. I've seen it done. I was a city editor and fired men, but I never did it for that reason. But I probably did it for reasons that were just as irrational. I didn't like the man. I believe that if a man works for any institution or industry for a given time, for a reasonable time, so that he's settled down into his job, he requires a kind of vested interest in his job. And it ought to be impossible to fire him wantonly and without compensation. All that I'm in favor of. I think that the men as a whole, as a group, can always bargain with the administration better than men alone. I'm in favor of that. But when the guild began to develop, it turned out very quickly that the guild was a conspiracy of the more incompetent and useless men on newspapers, not only against the boss, but also against the good men. That, like any other labor union, it began to be dominated by the selling platers. And it hence made its fight along lines that were, to me, silly. For instance, its fight to greatly exaggerate and increase the wages of office boys and of all of the third-rate people that hang around the edges of a newspaper staff. When I negotiated with the Guild, as you may remember, I tried hard to separate the actual newspapermen from all these auxiliaries. I don't care. I think the auxiliaries ought to be represented. But they ought not dominate the Guild. The newspapermen ought to speak for themselves. I never, as a negotiator for the Sun, objected to any reasonable demand made by the men. I don't know whether you remember that negotiation.
I do.
But I was always in favor of what the men, the actual good men, wanted, including some things that were expensive to the paper or seemed to me a little bit irrational. But nevertheless, I think a man is entitled to be a little irrational about himself. But when they began taking in girls who take want ads, telephone operators, and all such people, I washed my hands of it. I don't believe that's a newspaper guild anymore. It's just simply a gang of force-rate employees with the newspaper men as unwilling perfumers. I think the guild would be very well advised if it sloughed off all of those auxiliaries and went back to being a newspaper guild. It would then be dignified. The bosses would lose 3/4 of their arguments against it. And the higher administration on newspapers would be more friendly. Remember, the higher men on newspapers are nearly all men who have been active newspapermen. There are very few that haven't. I don't know anybody on the Sun papers in any executive position who hasn't been through the mill. Do you?
No, I don't.
A man that hadn't been through the mill would be a rather useless man. He'd never be chosen for his job on grounds of merit, be some extraneous thing. But the newspaper guild began making demands, particularly on the weaker papers. They seemed to delight in the fact that they had when they got hold of a weak proprietor who simply was helpless. They had strikes. They tried to ruin the man, and in the end they did ruin a good many of them. And it's a curious thing that all of the proprietors who were most friendly to him at the start were the men that they picked on for special persecution. For example, Davy Stern in Philadelphia and that fellow in St. Petersburg, Florida, who I don't know him at all. But he reached a point where he could not operate his paper under the demands being made. And he had two choices. One was to fold his paper, sell it to somebody, or sell it to somebody, and the other choice was to fight him. He decided to fight him. He threw out all guilds and unions, although he was a sincere friend of unionism. He found there were a lot of old printers down in Florida who didn't, having tried for a while being retired, they didn't like it. They wanted to get back in the office and get a little ink on them. And he soon had a composing room staff. He found that there were many newspaper men who didn't like the guild, but who did like working in Florida. Some of them came to see me when I was down there last winter, and they went down. He pays them fairly reasonable wages, and he's got his whole plant run by non-union people, and he's doing very well. And many other proprietors around the country are following suit, and I believe that some big city will make the break soon, and then you will see chaos. The unions will lose all they have gained by long years of work, particularly the typographical union, which was a very high-toned union, as you remember, run by men of intelligence, has lately got in the hands of extreme radicals whose main animating idea seems to be that the boss is a scoundrel, regardless of whether he is or not. That's a kind of a formal assumption that they make. And they're going to make it until someday the boss gets tired of it and throws them all out and keeps them out. There are papers at this minute that have no union organization whatever. One is one of the most prosperous papers in America, the Philadelphia Bulletin. Nobody in the Bulletin has to join a union. They have no prejudice against the union man. He can belong to the union all he pleases. He can work in the paper. They pay good wages. Always a little above the union scale. And he's up now a little above. I think the union scales in some crafts are getting so preposterous that there'll come a time soon when newspaper proprietors will simply refuse to pay them.
That's all.
Blue sky, smiling at me, nothing but blue sky do I see. Oh, to.
My name is Donald Kirkley, and my association with H.L. Mencken goes back to my connection with the Baltimore Sun, which began in 1920. What you're about to hear is, to the best of my knowledge, the only recording of his voice ever made, except for a few transcripts of radio broadcasts which were not preserved. On June 30th, 1948, at the request of the Library of Congress, I persuaded Mr. Mencken to come to Washington for this interview. He was a somewhat reluctant witness, having a deep distrust of microphones, and he agreed to come only after I had baited the hook with the statement that his voice was to be saved for posterity. Because we wanted this to be a natural record, we did no rehearsing. He didn't know what questions were to be asked, and I made them up as we went along. So you're actually eavesdropping on an informal conversation following natural lines, and hearing Mr. Mencken speak just as his friends and associates heard him day after day. You will notice that his voice seems a little tired, and that there are some signs of the recurrence of his annual affliction, hay fever. He had reported a political convention for the Sun and had not quite recovered from the fatigue. During the recording, I mentioned the fact jokingly that what we were putting on tape might be heard by people 1,000 years hence. At the time, Mr. Mencken seemed to pay no attention to this, but on the way home he was thoughtful for a few moments, and then he said, "Do you really think